series, and we are exploring neurodivergency and executive functioning with licensed counselor Brandon Tesser. Just to notify you all that all of our webinars will be recorded for future airing in podcast form. And tonight's format, it's about a short 20-minute presentation by Brandon, and then we open up the rest of the hour for open discussion and questions. And there's a few ways that you can ask questions, or a couple ways you can ask questions. Feel free to use that chat box on your bottom right, type in questions there. We'll be monitoring that to make sure that you get all your questions answered. As well as there is a little hand emoji on the bottom toolbar for you to raise your hand, and we can unmute you and I'll let you ask your question in person. And so with that, it's my honor to welcome my good friend, our good friend, Brandon Tessers from Effective Artistry. Brandon, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. All right, this is fun. I'm excited. This is the first time we're like recording it for later, podcast distribution and all that kind of stuff. So thank you all for being here. And just so that you know, yeah, we're going to do a presentation thing here at the beginning, but feel free to talk in the chat or throw questions out even during this early part. I like knowing that there's somebody at the other end of this, so I'm not just shouting into the void or telling Mike something I've told him 4 times already. Excuse me. All right, so welcome. Today we're going to be talking about executive functioning. What is executive functioning? And hopefully have time to get to some other things as well. Executive functioning it's a common term. It's a lot like terms like mindfulness, terms that get kind of popular and then thrown around, and everybody uses them in different ways to mean different things, which is great because language is a living thing and it's beautiful and that's how we communicate. So we don't go in much for that nonsense of there's right ways and wrong ways to use words. People use words to communicate, but we do want to be precise. So we're going to spend some time here at the beginning talking about what we mean when we use certain terminology, so that as we go forward, I don't have to do a little caveat every time to explain what I mean when I yes, a lot of the time when we're talking about executive functioning, we're talking about occupational or academic things, but the truth is that it's about everything. So let's get into some of the kind of traditional existing definitions. The original definition, I guess what you could say is the official kind of definition of executive functioning, is that it's the set of cognitive processes that allow you to control your behavior. So intellect allows us to come up with all kinds of ideas and analyses and plans. Executive functioning is what lets us take those cool creations and get them out into the world. Whether that's an idea of how to go about doing a project for work, whether it's an invention, whether it's a piece of art, or whether it's just literally trying to communicate to somebody else something that you want them to understand. Different people break it down differently. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but it all adds up to that in the official definition. It's internal things that happen in the brain that allow you to take your ideas and execute on them. That's where executive function comes from. A lot of times people make a mistake that it's about like an executive in a company that is trying to describe that. It's about executing on ideas. Now, for those of you who have heard the term executive functioning before, you probably more likely have heard it in the context of things that people do, you know, taking notes and having to-do lists and planners and calendars and those kinds of things. And like we said, language is a living thing, so that absolutely is also part of what executive functioning is. What we're going to do as we talk about this is we're going to separate these into two categories. We're going to talk about executive functioning skills, and that's those cognitive processes, the things that the brain does. And we're going to talk about executive functioning strategies, and that's those observable things, the supports, the systems, the structures and tools that we use in order to increase our capacity to function, to offload work from our native executive functioning onto external technology or other people or whatever it is that we're using. So executive functioning can be broken down into subfunctions. And it's important to note that executive functioning, as well as all the subfunctions we're going to talk about, all of these are constructs. They're conceptual models of how things work that we use that have validity, that have utility. About is the conscious mind. So the technical definition is the space in your mind in which you can hold information that you can manipulate, that you can use. Long-term memory can hold tons and tons and tons, nearly pretty, for all practical purposes, infinite information, but it's frozen. In order to do anything with it, we have to retrieve it from long-term memory into working memory. So working memory encompasses everything of which you are aware. And of course, the brain does all kinds of stuff with data and information that we are not aware of. But working memory, we're talking about the things that we are consciously aware of. Sequencing is the ability to hold things in some kind of sensical order, often chronological or simple to general, specific to general or vice versa. But just the ability to connect disparate pieces in some kind of sequence to hold them together. And part of that, yes, is the intellectual ability to kind of break a thing down into sub steps. But part of it is also about how intensely you can be aware in the moment of disparate steps. Excuse me, if I have a plan, we'll do a different number of steps just so there's no confusion. If I have a 20-step plan and I'm engaging in step 1, even though I intellectually know where I end up at step 20, if sequencing is something that I'm not very efficient with, I may not have a great awareness in that moment that step 1 is getting me closer to step 20. It doesn't feel like it, even if I'm intellectually aware of it. Emotional regulation is another common subfunction. The ability to be aware of, change one's own emotions, and to control the expression of one's own emotions. Impulse control is another one. We all have default, easy responses, the things that come most naturally in response to something happening in the environment. If we do not do that default, if we push to do something else, we're engaging in impulse control, spending energy to bypass that initial reaction into something else. Planning and prioritization are common subfunctions, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to go over all of them because there's so many different ways to break it down, but just to kind of give an overview. Notice that we're not talking about things like note-taking or calendar usage or study skills or anything like that. Those are strategies that help take a burden off of our executive functioning skills. Here's the most important, like, pocket-sized definition to take away from this. This is the thing that we're going to be using the most. I mentioned it earlier. We have finite resources. Our time is finite. Our energy is finite. A couple things that people are not as aware of. Our attention is finite. There are so many things happening in any given moment, way more than your brain can fit into awareness. So there is a process that the brain engages in pre-consciously, meaning outside of your awareness, outside of your control, that determines which things come into awareness and which things do not. So as an example, I use the same example every time. Until I say what I'm about to say in 5 seconds, none of you are consciously aware of the feeling of the chair underneath you or the floor underneath you. As soon as I say that, now all of a sudden you're aware of that feeling. Because the brain before was saying, we got all this data coming in, some of it's more useful than others. The feeling of the chair, not useful, let's not be aware of it, throw it away. But as soon as I put those words to it, then the brain says, oh, might be relevant, let's bring it in and make sure that we're aware of it. It's a very important one to know with attention, that attention is finite and that these decisions happen pre-consciously. They have to, because if we were going to consciously choose what to be aware of, we'd have to be aware of it first in order to choose. And we can't do that. Working memory, that awareness space, is also limited. That once something comes in through attention, some stuff goes right back out again pretty quickly. Some stuff we hang on to for a while because we find it relevant to solving some problem that we're working on. And until we solve that problem, we don't want to let it go. Processing is when we then take that information from working memory, compress it in some way, shape, or form, code it, and put it into long-term memory so that we can retrieve it later. And there's various ways that that can happen. We'll get into more of these definitions later. But we have finite resources. Those, time, energy, attention, and working memory, are used in anything that we do, no matter how easy. When I reach down to take a sip of my tea, some time, energy, attention, working memory went to that. Very minimal amount, except that I'm talking about it, so it's more than it would normally be, but it all takes something. unless it's an autonomic process, which means that stuff like heartbeats that the brain takes care of without our conscious input. And those resources are finite. So here's our pocket-sized definition, is executive functioning is about the management of our resources, choosing how to spend our resources on what things, in what ways, for what reasons, what return we believe we'll get out of them, and then observing what happens. That's what we're talking about. It's not about, if I do something, I think it's because it's important, and if I don't, it's because I think it's not important. It's that we all have way more important and good things that we care about and want to do than we are actually capable of doing with the resources we have. So we have to have a process to filter out which things are the ones we're going to engage in. Does anybody have any questions about executive functioning? I know that you're probably muted right now. You can put things in the chat if anybody does. I just want to be real clear what we mean. So strategies are important, skills are important. It's not that any one thing is more important than the next. It's that we want to have a kind of complex and nuanced understanding of the whole thing. As a general rule of thumb, you'll hear me say this a lot, that our brain is trying to manage resources, right? So we want to spend the minimum amount of resources on a thing. And the minimum amount of resources to spend on a thing is to not be aware of it at all. And then the next past that is to be aware of it as a static, unchangeable thing. It just is this, it always has been and always will be. And then we can get into a binary where it's either this or that, and then a third option and more and more and more. It's not that more nuance or more complexity is better. It's not. It's about going as complex as you need to in order to accomplish the things that you're trying to accomplish. We want the simplest strategies, the simplest understandings to get by. But if that doesn't work, then we get more into the nuance. So because of the nature of this series and what we're doing here, we will get into nuance and complexity a lot because people wouldn't be here if the simple understandings were working for them. So we need to go to the next. It doesn't invalidate the simple understandings. Simplicity, simple ways of knowing things can be accurate, can be true, but imprecise. We want to look for more precision. Maybe we'll very briefly touch on neurodiversity. It's a quicker one to define, and then we can move into opening things up to Q&A. So neurodiversity is a concept that was introduced in the last 40 or 50 years, started particularly in the autism community. The concept of neurodiversity is that, as with other variations in humans, like height, like hair color, that the way that a person's brain functions has natural variations from one person to the next. Going back to our executive functioning and subfunctions, we simplify in terms of saying, oh, one person has better initiation or worse initiation. What we really mean, and whenever you hear me say better or worse or good or bad or strong or weak in this kind of context, what we mean is efficiency. That in order to initiate, how much does it cost me? How much of my time, energy, whatever, does it cost me to initiate versus somebody else trying to initiate? And we don't have precise ways of measuring these things, but we do have an awareness that it is different from person to person. Everybody's brain is different, everybody's body is different, everybody is unique. So I don't go in for this idea of some people are neurodivergent and some people are neurotypical. Everybody is unique, and the concept of neurodiversity is that it's covering a community or, you know, the human species as a whole, and the variations that exist in neurological functioning in there. Different people, again, will take it different ways from there, so we'll address some of that just so that everybody knows what we're talking about. A lot of people who talk about neurodiversity will talk about it being non-pathological, meaning that certain neurotypes or ways of functioning are not diseases, not pathological, not problems that need to be cured, just different ways of functioning. Now, some people will take that to the opposite extreme and say that things like ADHD is a superpower, for example, which is also not what we are going to be talking about here. Differences are differences. They are advantages in some contexts, disadvantages in other contexts, neutral in many contexts. I am 6'5", as you're all so aware, seeing a little portion of my body in this screen on Zoom, or I guess listening to my voice if you're listening to this later. I'm 6'5", and people look at me and they say, wow, being tall, that must be great. And it is when I'm trying to reach something on a high shelf, but it really sucks when I'm flying across the Pacific Ocean in coach for 12 hours. So any variation, any natural, non-pathological variation in human existence has its advantages and its disadvantages, depending on what it is you're trying to do, what the context is. And yes, that means that certain environments, certain cultures make things more or less difficult, but it does not mean that people's different experiences and different ways of functioning are only creations of the environment in which they are. It's about the interaction between a person and their environment. There's a term epigenetics that we may talk about at some point about the interaction between our genetics and our environment. So neurodiversity is a paradigm at which to look in the variation, through which to look at the variation in human neurological functioning in its full variance. Some people will identify as neurodivergent, which varies depending on who you ask what qualifies as neurodivergent. Some people will, for example, throw mental illness in there, and some people will not. Some people will throw giftedness in there, and some people will not. Giftedness is not a term I'm a big fan of for some obvious and maybe some less obvious reasons, but we'll do that another time. But generally speaking, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other similar kind of neurodevelopmental conditions are widely kind of considered to be neurodivergent conditions. Again, though, this is not in comparison to a fictional neurotypical person. It's that in a bell curve, there are people that are closer to the middle and people that are further away from it. And so when we say neurodivergent, we're talking about people who are further from that middle in the bell curve. But one person, I might be far from the middle of the bell curve in terms of height, but right in the middle of the bell curve in terms of eye color, right? So there are different traits. Some have pulls and correlations on each other. Some are completely unrelated. Does anyone have any questions about neurodiversity or neurodivergent? So you'll hear me use the term neurodivergent or other phrases like outside the norm to refer to people who are further from that center distribution in the bell curve in a given context. Whatever specific thing we are talking about in that time is where we're talking about being farther from the middle. All right. So the goal of understanding executive functioning and understanding neurodiversity or neurodivergence is that we want to create lives that fit ourselves. That sometimes, yes, we want to make changes in how we go about doing things, develop our skills and acquire new knowledge, make changes in ourselves. Sometimes we want to make changes in the environment, in what it is that we're exposed to or attempting to do. And sometimes we want to make changes in the way that we and our environment interact, the systems, the plans, the strategies of how we go about interacting with the environment without changing it or what it is that we're going for. I am going to fly coach sometimes, even though I'm 6'5", and I'll just have to deal with it. But when I go buy a car, even if I think a Mini Cooper is a great vehicle, I don't actually know if it is, but even if I did, I'm not going to buy a Mini Cooper because I'm not going to fit well in it. So there are some things that we have more choice and control over, some things less. There's never going to be such a thing as a perfect life where you only do things that you love and are perfect and optimal for you at all times. But we want to get closer and closer to that. The goal is not to take ourselves and get ourselves to be better at forcing ourselves to do things that we don't want to do. It's to be clear about when it's important and when it's worth doing things that we don't want to do and why, and trying to minimize that and maximize how much we get to do the things that we want to do. All right, I feel like that's a good place to open it up from the plus I needed a sip of my tea anyway. Does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about or anything at all? The point of the Q&A is that it doesn't have to be on the theme, on the topic. We're doing that so that people can reference things in an order that we can kind of build on over time. But the questions can be anything about anything.
Brandon, so oftentimes in schools, the traditional train of thought is, okay, we've identified a kid has a executive functioning deficiency in some way that's preventing them from meeting deadlines or meeting assignments. And often the answer is the notebook, or we're going to organize their folders into colors. And that works sometimes, but what are some other things that we can try to help our kids out?
Yeah. I like those strategies. And again, as a general rule of thumb, the most common strategies are common for a reason. They work for most people most of the time in most circumstances. They wouldn't be commonly spread if that wasn't true. But for those for whom those common strategies don't work, you got to get more into the individual. So I'll say again, I will give definitely some specific examples, but we always want to look in at effective artistry. We talk about looking in these three kind of avenues of change. There's changing the self, developing skills and changing things over time. There's changing the environment. There's changing the way that the self and the environment interact. So strategies like those, I would put into changing the way that the self and the environment interact. Having those kinds of, color coding your notebooks or how to rearrange your notes and those kinds of things. My big place that I always want to start first is with observation. That I want to have precise language to describe what it is that is happening and how it is different from what we want to be happening. So in other words, if somebody is unable to turn in their assignments on time, there are a million different reasons that that could be the case. We're never really going to be able to narrow things down to such like a specific level of detail. Remember, we just keep going until we find a solution and then we stop. We don't need to know everything. But we want to start evaluating for specifics, because if I, for example, say that I can't turn all my stuff in on time, and therefore my goal is to turn everything in on time. Well, if I try some strategy that takes me from turning in 50% of my stuff on time to 60% of my stuff on time, I'm going to drop that strategy if all I'm really looking at is, am I turning everything in on time or not? Because that way of doing things takes resources, and if I don't see a return. So I like to start with observation, where we put labels and scales and even making up words, completely new gibberish words, to give the brain the ability to prioritize different information, so that it brings different things into awareness, it thinks about them differently, processes and retrieves them differently. But as far as specific strategies, I love strategies where we take a thing and switch it into a different way of interacting in terms of what sense you use. Taking things that typically we do through reading and writing and turning it into speaking and listening, right? Like having people use audiobooks versus having to read textbooks is a very common one that can be helpful. For people who have a hard time getting up in the morning, a very common and easy thing that may help is to switch from using a blaring audio alarm clock to one of those sunrise alarm clocks that puts light into the room. I have a question. Is it helpful to know which of the subfunctions are causing a challenge to executive function? And if so, how do you identify the subfunction that is causing the logjam? And yes, absolutely. But this is why people break it down into different subfunctions, because they disagree on what's the most useful way to group different experiences. So this is right back to the observation piece, that we want to be clear on identifying. I identify initiation in these ways, in these terms. Because if I do that and I start to develop things that help me, then when I identify later on again that I'm struggling with initiation, I have a big old list of strategies to go back to. Oh, maybe I need to, for example, do a co-working situation or a body doubling situation, meaning that we can just put another person in the room with me, even if they're doing something completely unrelated to me, but having them there helps me to start. So I want to know those words so that I can start to establish patterns and predict what I will need and make it easier to solve problems, as opposed to approaching each new situation with the basics, which is, this is what I want, this is what is happening, how do I bridge that gap? I want to develop, ability to do that more easily. So how do you identify the subfunction that is causing the logjam? Experimentation. It's an empirical process. You gather the data that you can get, your intellect combined with whoever else you're involving in this situation and the data that they're adding, you come up with your best analysis that gives you an idea of what thing to change and the prediction of, if I change this thing, that means this other thing will change and result, and then you try it. And the important thing to know, again, in the way that we work, is there is no way to fail that process. If you come up with an idea that you think will resolve the problem, so for example, if I say, me not being able to get this paper done is a problem with my initiation. And because I've identified it as initiation, that tells me I should use some of my strategies that help me to initiate. And so let me try to do body doubling. If I then go do body doubling and I still don't start the paper, that doesn't mean that I failed. It means that the strategy, that my best guess, my analysis and prediction was incorrect. And guess what? Nobody is correct 100% of the time. We can't predict the future. We're making our best guesses. We try it. And then when we're trying the experiment, we gather the data again and circle back around to analysis. So we come up with a strategy, we try it. If it works, great. If we try it and it doesn't work, great. Now we know more. We're going to throw that away and move forward. If we didn't do it at all, we forgot to, or we just couldn't get ourselves to for whatever reason, great. Now we know more and we can throw it away again and move on. We don't want to fall, one of my big things is when we don't understand the full complexity of executive functioning, we simplify it into personality flaws, character weakness. We say that someone is lazy, or we say that I'm just not motivated, or whatever terminology we use. And again, I'm a fan of any word that is useful, but if you try to define those words clearly and what you end up coming up with is basically some version of there is something about me that is deficient, then that's not very useful. And in fact, it can often be pretty harmful, both in ourselves when we beat ourselves up, or when other people use those words to describe us and the messages that they give us about ourselves and how changeable or unchangeable certain things are. So if we come up with, we thought it was initiation, but all our initiation strategies didn't work, well, we can either try and come up with a different initiation strategy, or we can go back and say, maybe this isn't initiation, or maybe that's part of it, but maybe this is also an issue with sequencing. That the reason that I'm having so much of a hard time initiating on this, even with those strategies, is because I don't actually understand the steps involved in doing this thing. So if I were to start it, I don't know what to do first, so I don't know how to start. It's just a big, like if I told anybody here right now to say, here's your homework, go build a house. The first thing you would do is say, okay, what? Or at least me, maybe some of you are really great at building houses. I would have to do a lot of work to learn what goes into building a house. And learning comes from one of two places. Either we experience a thing, or we get the information from somebody else. Maybe that's somebody teaching us directly because that's their role, like a teacher or a coach or whatever, or a parent. Maybe it's just conversing with friends. Maybe it's reading a book or going online and searching up videos or articles, but it's other people have put that information there. And by and large, it's a lot more efficient to learn from other people than it is to just come up with our random attempts at things. So we'll talk a lot about different types of research as we go about doing this thing. And research is important, it's valid, it's helpful, but it is always about correlation, not causation. That even if we have a very strong correlation of 80% of the time when we see X, we also see Y. Well, if you're one of the 20% for whom there is no Y, it doesn't matter that the other 80% of the time it is. But that research, that experience, that collected knowledge and wisdom gives us good places to start. If I think I might be dealing with X and Y, I'm going to start in this place because 80% of the time that's where they see things. But again, if it doesn't apply to you, we then just move on. We can talk more about some specific strategies, or actually, what might be good is if somebody, without giving away any identifying information or things that you wouldn't want on a podcast or a live stream or whatever, if anybody has a specific question, then that can allow us to dig into the specifics about how executive functioning might be a part of that, or how we might go about trying to work on that thing. Again, as a general rule, the more general a thing is, the more frequently it applies, but the less impact it has in each case in which it applies. The more specific a thing is, the more impact it has where it applies, but the less frequently it applies. So everybody here, I can confidently say is a person. I can say that that is true about all the people that are here. But what information does that give me about each of you? Not a lot, because it applies to every person. But Mike, you are Mike Wang, that only applies to you. Well, I'm sure there's probably other people with the same name, but it gives me a lot more information about who you are, right? So specific questions are great. I try to keep things general when I don't have a specific question, because for anybody who might be listening or watching in the future, I want it to be as open as possible. But it's also, again, important to know that when we make a suggestion or think that a certain strategy might be helpful, if it's not, that's because the strategy wasn't a good strategy for you to use. It's not because you're deficient. Because sometimes we'll see people who will say, everybody else makes lists, but I can't make lists. What's wrong with me? I'm the worst. I got to just get myself to make a list. And then we get stuck. The silly metaphor I always use is when you approach a door, and because of how you're approaching it and what you see, you think it's a door that you need to push to open, but in reality, it needs to be pulled open. And you go to push it at first, and it doesn't open. The very next thing that pretty much everyone is going to do is push it again a little bit harder. Because you already did your best analysis as you approached the door, whether to whatever extent you were aware of it, that this is a push door and it didn't work. Let me just make sure. And you can push on that door for 3 days. It's not going to hurt you, but it's going to take up a lot of your time and energy that you could have spent in other ways if you had backed up and said, you know what, this pushing strategy isn't working for me. Maybe I should see if there's a different strategy that might work. I don't want people banging their heads against the wall. So when we get into specific populations, especially in neurodivergent, ADHD and autism and all these kinds of things, when we say, oh, many ADHD people struggle with this and doing this thing helps them, then for a person who's already upset about strategies not working for them, or for a person who's already thought of themselves as being deficient in some way, but now has found community in the ADHD kind of label and community, and if that doesn't work, it can kind of bring all that same stuff back. Like, oh man, even stuff that's supposed to work for people with ADHD doesn't work for me. What is wrong with me? So just kind of keep coming back to that. We try it, we see if it works, great. If not, we try something new. Well, this is a good comment. I'm interested in thinking through how one addresses the challenges in executive functioning without giving the feeling that it's a deficiency. Separately, we struggle with multiple subfunctions, sequencing and impulse control, and I'm excited to learn more strategies to support that. Yeah, that's important. And I'm glad you said that. There's a reason that in this first episode, this first webinar, whatever, that we're spending so much time on these kind of big generalities. Because again, if you start with the assumption that it is a deficiency in the self, then all your strategies are based around trying to address that. And I'm not saying that there's never a deficiency in the self, meaning if I'm trying to reach something that's 10 feet high and I can't reach it, yeah, the reason I can't reach it is because I can't reach to 10 feet. But if I was trying to reach something at 8 feet, I could reach that. So I could change my goal, or I can say, yeah, I can't do that on my own. I better go get a stool and try and do it. Or I could say, you know what, I just can't jump high enough. Someone else my same height might have the vertical leap to be able to jump and grab that thing. So I'm going to start working on my vertical leap so that eventually I'll be able to jump and grab it without getting a stool, or without giving up on getting the 10-foot thing and going for something that's at 8 feet, or without asking somebody else for help who can reach it. So I'm not trying to give the impression that nobody struggles. We definitely do. And I should mention with the neurodivergency or neurodiversity piece as well, that people will say things like, when we're talking about, for example, ADHD or depression or whatever thing, people will say, that's not a thing. Everybody experiences that. That's universal. And there's truth to those statements. When somebody says something like, everybody forgets sometimes. Yes, everybody does. It's the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of those experiences that lead us to qualify it as a specific grouping, a specific condition or label or whatever it is. Yes, everybody feels sad sometimes, but some people feel so sad so often and for so long that it is useful for us to call it major depressive disorder so that we can approach it differently and try different treatment methods or do different types of research or whatever. I'm not trying to downplay struggles or deficiencies. I'm just trying to say that there are multiple ways to look at things. Sometimes it is about learning how to do something different. The one thing here that I want to be pretty consistent on, though, is if we were to talk about like a sport, we were talking about sports analogies before we started today. If we were talking about tennis versus initiation as a skill, right? If I played tennis today and I was terrible, I couldn't like return a volley or get a serve inbounds or whatever. That's the extent of my tennis vocabulary. That's about it. I would not then come to myself and say, I just wasn't trying hard enough. I really got to focus, and tomorrow I will be great at tennis. Next time I try this, if I just really force myself, if I really try and care, then I will be able to ace people all the time. I guess I had one more tennis vocabulary word there. Actually, I don't even know if that's tennis. I know that from volleyball. We would know that that's ridiculous. We would say, like, no, you don't get good at tennis just by really, really trying and wanting it. But a lot of time, for some reason, in executive functioning, we don't allow for that. We say, if you just tried harder, cared more, then you could do it. It's true. You can develop your skills. You can get better at things, but not in a day and not by just wanting it more. In fact, if something's bothering you, it's because you already want it a lot. If you didn't want it, then it wouldn't be bothering you that you were struggling to do it. And that doesn't mean the thing itself. There's a lot of times that we're doing things that we hate, but it's because it's connected to something else that we want, and we think it's worth doing the thing that we hate to get the thing that we want later. But still, you want it. You wouldn't have thought about it. You wouldn't have made an intention to do it in the first place. And if you did, and then didn't end up following through, you wouldn't be upset about it. If you're upset about it afterwards, it's because you wanted it. So I don't know what wanting it more is supposed to do for anybody, or how we would even translate that into something meaningful. Yeah, so that's my thing, is we don't want to keep trying to push on the pull door. If thinking of it as a deficiency does something that enables you to make changes and get what you want, make your life more like you want it to be, cool. I'm not going to take that away from anybody. But we don't want to lock in as that's the only way to make changes. And we definitely don't want to lock in as that's the only way to make changes, and you can just make it by somehow flipping some set of levers in your head magically. If you could do that, you would have done it already. You wanted to accomplish the thing. If there was a way for you to do it that way without making any changes other than just how you thought about it, you would have done it. Now, developing language can give you new ways to think and notice and whatever, but that's still making a change. We got to learn that new language, learn that new way of looking at a thing. Yeah, okay. The idea of asking for help is often the barrier, or there's a stigma around it because I should be able to do X by now by myself. Yes, this is a great one. I think two of the best skills that people can develop, especially when you're outside the norm in one way, is A, to say I don't know, and B, to quit. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but as we've been hitting over and over, we lock ourselves, we make a decision, right? At 17, we decide what thing we're going to study, what career we're going to have, because at 17, we know everything, right? And then 20 years later, we're doing it, but we're miserable. But, I've decided I want to be a lawyer or an actor or a writer, even though it has been completely unenjoyable to me. But I'm still following the decision that the 17-year-old me made. Every moment, we get more information about ourselves, about what it is we're attempting to do, about the world. I never want to defer to the version of myself that knew less than the version of myself now that knows more. I know that sounds a little abstract, but in the course of a day, sometimes that means things like, if I decide I'm going to work on my paper tonight at 6 o'clock, and then 6 o'clock rolls around, I'm like, yeah, I'm not feeling it. Well, A, you're probably not going to do it. B, if you think that the morning version of you that knew less, that, the morning version of you made a guess that at 6 o'clock, I'll be in the right place, I'll have the energy and the knowledge I need to do this thing. And then 6 o'clock rolls around and it's not, well, that's because you learned new things. You now know where you're at in this moment. Does that mean it's always okay then to say, never mind, I'm not going to do it? No, because sometimes things have consequences that are important enough to be able to find some way to get ourselves to do it. But we just didn't know. We made our best guess. Again, we can't predict the future. So quitting and saying, I don't know, they're related, but I'll do both a little bit separately. Quitting to me is the ability to then say, I have learned more. It doesn't mean that I'm giving up on my goal necessarily. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it means, oh, I thought this thing would be fun and it's not, I'm not going to do this anymore. But it can mean giving up on the way I've been attempting to achieve this goal. You know, it's important for me, for whatever reason, for example, to lose weight. And nobody actually really cares about weight. They care about how they feel and how they perceive themselves and how they think other people perceive them. But weight is a marker that we can use to kind of look at as we're attempting to change those things. So if my goal is to lose weight and I decide I'm going to do it by doing the keto diet, and I'm trying the keto diet and I'm failing at it, or maybe I do it well, but I don't lose that much weight or whatever. I don't want to keep doing that for another 6 months, pushing on the pull door. I want to say, okay, this isn't working. I'm going to stop this and go find a new way to do it instead of just trying the old way harder. Saying I don't know, and yeah, absolutely, the stigma, especially for people who consider themselves or are considered smart. It is really difficult to then say, I don't know. Especially people like yours truly who are really good at BSing, that you could ask me about nearly anything and I can just make up enough words that sound good enough and talk long enough that eventually you'll stop paying attention before I ever reveal that I didn't know anything about what you were talking about or move the conversation along. We fall back on that because it's easier than saying, I don't know. And this is really, I mean, something that I understand why we do this. I understand why having knowledge and sharing knowledge is something that we value. But if you look at the greatest thinkers, the people who've accomplished the most or most revered, we talk about humility all the time, right? That those who are able to do the most typically have a habit of saying, I don't know this thing, I want to learn. Because if we don't say, I don't know, then we can't engage in learning and developing whatever it is that we don't know. We just got to, especially when we're struggling and other people can see that we're struggling, you know, in school, right? My grades are slipping, I'm not getting things done, and I'm really upset and embarrassed, but I'm going to hide all my struggles from everybody. The number of clients I have who've gone through this process in college, especially in that freshman year, where things start to slip, but they don't want to let anybody know that they're struggling, and then it gets worse. And then it gets even more important to not let anybody know. And it's not until things are completely falling apart that anybody knows what's going on. Whereas if in that first moment of struggle, that if they had said, I don't know what I'm doing, I need some help, that things can be turned around pretty quick. You know, in most cases, those big shifts from doing really well to doing really poorly doesn't come from one big thing. Most of the time it comes from a little thing and a little thing and a little thing just stacking up and not getting addressed because we don't want to admit to anybody else that we're struggling or that we don't know what to do. So yes, I love saying I don't know. I love saying I could use some help, some support. I love saying this isn't working, I'm quitting, I need to find a different, better thing. We want to encourage that. And, you know, we've talked about this series, this podcast is, you know, kind of geared, yes, at people who are working on these things themselves, but also for people who are trying to assist others who are working with executive functioning. And I'll say that the best thing you can do if you're trying to help somebody else with this is not to explain to them, like I've been trying, that saying I don't know is good. Sometimes that's helpful. It's to model for them that saying I don't know is good. That call it being humble, you know, call it asking for help, whatever. That the self-awareness, back in executive subfunction terms, right? The self-awareness to know what I do know and what I don't know, and to be comfortable with that, not embarrassed or ashamed, not making sacrifices in how I'm going about things in order to preserve some sense of, you know, self-reliance or whatever. That if I model that, doing that will help me to enjoy my life more, and anybody else looking around at me closely will see that. And they'll see what it connects to. Especially for parents and children, and especially these days, You know, I say a lot that this is the hardest time in human history to be a parent. Obviously not in terms of like protecting your children from being eaten by wild animals, but in terms of complexity and, you know, and it's also the hardest time in human history to be a child or really anything, because as time goes on, things become more complicated and more difficult. But with the opportunity for things to be better, the more options there are, the more likely it is that one of those options will be a better fit for you than if there were fewer options. But it comes with complexity and difficulty. So these days, children will know more than their parents about the things that the children care about. This is really the first time that adults have not had a near monopoly, near total control on the information that gets shared to children. I mean, there's always been, you know, the cousin that you can talk to or whatever, but there's never before been a way for kids to be like, I'm into weather patterns. Let me go look up like all the research and foremost experts in weather patterns and learn the details of things that my parents have never dreamed of. It's happening now. I mean, it's been happening for a while, obviously, but so yeah, so to have that we're going to call it humility just to make it easier to say, to have that humility to say to our children, I don't know about this, but it sounds cool. Can you teach me about it? That kind of modeling that makes it clear that there's nothing to be ashamed of in not knowing a thing, and that in fact, letting other people know that you don't know is what creates connection, is what gives people an opportunity to help each other. You know, we talk about these kind of double standard things all the time where people won't want to give their friends or family any sense that they're struggling because they don't want their friends and family to feel obligated to help them. But if you flip that and say, okay, well, when your friend or your family gives you a sense that they're struggling, what do? You help them, okay. And how do you feel when you help them? Do you feel good about that? Do you feel competent? Do you like the fact that you were able to help those people? So who are you then to deny them the opportunity to do the same in return? I like to flip things around on people like that sometimes. that yeah, my job isn't to control your reaction, it's just to tell you the truth. I don't know a thing. That doesn't obligate you to do anything. You now get to choose whether or not you want to help me with this. Oh, I didn't see this one. Oh, I see it now. How can parents help tell if a child is not motivated or not able to pay attention or embarrassed about a learning disability? It seems that as time goes by, it is harder to tell. That is true, and it's especially true with children who are able to read social situations, read your responses, who have facility with language and expression and communication, and can mask is a term that we'll probably talk about at some point, or hide things or whatever, right? They're pretty good at obfuscating things. You know, some are better at it than others. What I would say first is to define those terms. So motivated, what does that mean? Because that's one of those words that can be really helpful if it's used in certain ways, or really unhelpful or even harmful if it's used in other ways. So you want to define that. You want to have some way of looking at, discussing it, being clear about how to distinguish one from the other. So here's a kind of generic exercise that I like to use a lot. Imagine that you have two videos of a person from, you know, different multiverses or whatever, covering the same 5 minutes, the same day, month, whatever. How would a viewer looking at that video know in which one the person is more motivated? Or how would a viewer looking at those two videos be able to know in which one a child is embarrassed or a child is not able to pay attention? We want to define it in observable terms. And obviously there are things that happen internally that we're not going to see on a video, but we want to start with some way to bring meaning to these words. Because otherwise, one person could say they're not motivated, one person could say they're not able to pay attention, one person could say they're embarrassed, and how would we distinguish between whether any one of those things is true? We need to have some way to get clear and specific about it. And yeah, it does get harder to tell as time goes by, both in an individual case as people become more aware of themselves and how they operate, so they can modify that and choose who they let know what thing, but also just generally as time goes on and all this stuff kind of gets mishmashed together. I'll say that generally, and there are obviously exceptions to this rule, I'll be very clear about that. But generally, people, generally a person is able to do, capable of doing anything that any person can do given the right context, the right supports, the right amount of time and energy, the right resources. And again, obviously there are exceptions to this in which a person is legitimately not capable under any circumstances of doing a thing. But when we're talking about attention, more often than not, most people can notice a thing. It may take more, it may cost more for them to notice the thing, and the amount by which it costs them more. Next week, we're going to talk about cost and value, the accomplishment equation, and that gets a lot more into the details of how to do this. The amount by which it costs them more takes it from being a thing that was worth paying attention to now being a thing that's not. It's still valuable, it's just not worth how much it would take me to pay attention to it. And that's not a willingness thing or a me being above it all thing. It's a legitimate assessment of, if it takes you 30 minutes to write a paper and it takes me 8 hours in a panic attack, sometimes there are going to be papers that both of us, it's worth that. But a lot of the time there's going to be papers where it's worth your 30 minutes, but not worth my 8 hours in a panic attack, because the cost is different. So sometimes it really is about helping to understand the differences in how that attentional resource works. And we can talk more about that in the future. But I've had 2 different people tell me we're coming up on time. So I will wrap up, because otherwise I would talk until 4 in the morning. But next week we will talk cost and value, the accomplishment equation, and start getting into being able to distinguish these things one from another. Thank you all for your questions, for being here.
Brandon, thank you so much for sharing and offering us a different perspective on how to think about ourselves and those that we care about. Thank you all for coming tonight. Next week, episode 2, as Brandon said, we'll be covering cost versus value, the accomplishment equation. Same time, same link. Feel free to share that link out with friends. And we look forward to seeing you guys all next week, Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Central.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome.
Thank you.